Opening the center promises dynamic play and invites rapid piece development towards the enemy king. Mirroring the central pawn opens up symmetrical attacking possibilities and sets the stage for classical development. Developing a knight to its most active square immediately challenges black's central pawn, creating dynamic tension. Developing the knight to a central square offers robust defense to the pawn and prepares for rapid piece activity. Instantly setting up a Spanish gambit, this bishop targets the knight, creating intricate tactical possibilities and straining black's queenside defense. Probing the bishop's influence, this pawn advance challenges white's aggressive intentions early. Sacrificing pawn structure for open lines, a bold gambit aiming for queenside pressure by disrupting black's defenses. Doubling those pawns on the c-file weakens your pawn structure and opens lines for the opponent's pieces. Securing the monarch allows for greater freedom in developing attacking pieces toward the center. Solidifying the center pawn structure with f6, while seemingly defensive, significantly weakens the dark squares around your monarch and creates long-term positional liabilities. Challenging black's central pawn structure immediately, d4 aims to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file, potentially opening lines for white's pieces and creating weaknesses black will struggle to defend. Abandoning the pawn immediately opens the e-file for your rook, potentially leading to swift central pressure against white's king. However, this also concedes the bishop pair and weakens your kingside pawn structure, a critical positional compromise to manage carefully as the game progresses. Recapturing with the knight immediately reclaims central influence and prepares to develop further, a solid, textbook response to black's recent pawn push, aiming to exploit the slightly weakened kingside black has created by doubling their c-pawns. Challenging white's central pawn structure, black gambits a pawn to gain central space and potentially open lines for their pieces, aiming to disrupt white's harmony and create active counterplay. This move prioritizes activity over material equality, hoping to exploit weaknesses in white's development, particularly the now weakened queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the center and preparing to challenge black's isolated pawns on the queenside is the immediate goal as the knight repositions for maximum influence. Sacrificing the queen here opens up a fascinating, albeit precarious, endgame transition. The immediate material loss, however, must be justified by a swift repositioning of pieces to exploit white's slightly awkward development. Opening the d-file for your rook now offers immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns and sets up potential infiltrations towards the enemy king, while simultaneously untangling your pieces from an awkward knight placement. Bringing the bishop out aims to develop a piece and prepare for castling, while also eyeing the central pawn structure. It's a logical step towards activating the queenside pieces and connecting the rooks. However, this placement might leave it vulnerable to future knight incursions or pawn advances, requiring careful consideration of its safety and ultimate purpose in the evolving game. Securing the queenside, white aims to prevent black's pawns from advancing freely and potentially launching a queenside expansion, while simultaneously preparing to develop the light-squared bishop and gain a slight edge in space. Securing the king opposite a potentially aggressive pawn chain opens up central files for both sides, a double-edged sword where active piece play will dictate success. Developing the bishop to a more active square, b3 aims to contest the central files and prepare for potential kingside pressure, subtly hinting at a desire to exploit the slightly exposed black monarch after its journey to the queenside. Black aims to untangle the queenside pawns and potentially activate the queenside rook along the b-file, though this maneuver might come at the cost of weakening the dark squares around the king. Recentering the knight here on c3 injects a new dimension of pressure onto the d5 square, preparing to potentially contest black's central pawn majority and create more dynamic play rather than passively defending. Developing the bishop to d6 aims to square off against white's advanced queenside pawns and potentially eye the vulnerable b2 square, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks. Controlling the queenside expansion is the immediate priority, aiming to restrict black's pawn structure and prevent a potential breakthrough. Black's pawn thrust aggressively claims central space, creating a bold outpost on c4 that directly challenges White's queenside structure and potentially stifles their piece mobility. Opening up the A-file now presents White with dynamic counterplay, forcing Black to confront the immediate structural consequences of their pawn chain's advance. Capturing the knight on b3 immediately injects a chaotic, tactical flavor into the position, transforming what was developing into a positional maneuvering game. Black willingly concedes pawn structure on the queenside, creating isolated pawns for White in return for the crucial central pawn on c4. This opening up of lines, particularly the A-file, now presents a new set of dynamic possibilities for both sides to exploit. The structural concessions are significant, and Black must now prove that the initiative gained through this bold capture outweighs the long-term positional weaknesses. Grabbing that pawn opens up the A-file, but at what cost to your own pawn structure? White's pieces are getting uncomfortably close to Black's king, creating immediate attacking potential. Yet the scattered pawns on the queenside feel like a significant long-term vulnerability that might be exploited later. The knight's retreat to e7 defensively anchors the kingside structure, preparing to contest the central files and potentially launch a counterthrust on the kingside, although it concedes a significant central presence to White's now unleashed queen's rook. Unleashing a sudden, forcing check aims to disorganize the opponent's pawn structure and potentially gain material by disrupting their king's safety. Embracing the newly opened b-file, Black's monarch seeks refuge, acknowledging the perilous central open lines and the looming threat of White's pieces poised for penetration. The king's vulnerability is paramount, and this aggressive check forces Black's monarch into a more exposed position, potentially disrupting their nascent coordination. The king's desperate scramble across the board highlights a critical positional weakness. The pawn structure in front of it is shattered, leaving it exposed to incessant checks from the rook and bishop batteries, forcing Black into a defensive posture that bleeds initiative. Initiating a swift pawn thrust on the queenside, White disrupts Black's pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open files and create weaknesses. Reclaiming the piece with the knight opens up a critical diagonal for Black's remaining bishop, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside now that White's monarch is exposed and lacks immediate defensive support. Prying open that d-file now opens the door for your rook to become a genuine nuisance on the king's doorstep, while simultaneously reinforcing your central pawns and creating a strategic barrier. Retrieving the bishop to c8 is a defensive maneuver, aimed at protecting the weakened pawn structure on the queenside. Black seeks to consolidate after White's aggressive pawn push and rook activity, prioritizing king safety and preparing to bring more pieces into play. The pawn sacrifice opens the b-file for your rook, aiming to exploit the exposed king and the unfortunate placement of Black's bishop, creating an immediate tactical opportunity that forces Black to react defensively. Relinquishing the bishop for the pawn grants Black a pawn majority on the kingside, but it fundamentally disrupts their piece coordination. The rook on a8, now free, becomes a genuine threat, potentially forcing concessions or even initiating a decisive attack along the open rank. Establishing a central pawn majority now becomes White's prime objective after seizing the c-file, aiming to push these pawns forward and create a passed threat. Repositioning the bishop to b7 seems like an attempt to secure the c7 pawn and offer some protection to the king's diagonal, but it neglects the growing pressure on the queenside and leaves the a-file entirely open for White's rook to exploit further. This maneuver might also impede the coordination of Black's own pieces, creating potential weaknesses that White's advanced pawns and active pieces can exploit. Seizing the open file, this action initiates a positional duel for the critical c-file, aiming to liberate the rook from its passive post and directly threaten Black's pawn structure. Developing the rook to d7 offers a flexible solution, aiming to centralize it and prepare for potential activation on the d-file, or even to contest White's control over the semi-open c-file should it become relevant later. The rook finally claims a deserved presence on the open b-file, immediately increasing pressure on Black's queenside structure and forcing a defensive reassessment. This maneuver is crucial for activating White's remaining pieces and setting up potential breakthroughs against Black's somewhat precarious pawn formation, particularly the isolated d-pawn, which now becomes a tangible weakness. Black's bishop now retreats to a more solid defensive post, reinforcing the central pawn structure and offering some potential counterplay on the queen side, though its mobility is still somewhat restricted by its own pawns. Unlocking the semi-open file, White immediately pressures the queen side, potentially disrupting Black's defensive setup and creating tactical opportunities against the c4 pawn. The Black king, suddenly exposed by the rook's journey, seeks refuge on the queen's flank, hoping to rejoin the defensive fray and escape the perpetual checks. Initiating a flanking maneuver, White repositions the rook to the adjacent file, preparing to apply pressure along the b-file and potentially disrupt Black's pawn structure. Reevaluating the material balance becomes paramount, as the rook's sacrifice on a7 has seemingly paid off, forcing a king retreat that might yet prove insufficient. Securing the kingside with potential pawn advances, this maneuver aims to solidify White's position and prepare for a more active middle-game engagement, perhaps initiating a rook lift or preparing a pawn storm. Reactivating the rook to the central files offers a much-needed counterstrike against White's encroaching pieces. Opening a new avenue for the rook on the 7th rank now pressures Black's exposed king, disrupting its tentative safety and forcing immediate defensive adjustments. The bishop now relocates to a diagonal that allows it to eye the c5 pawn and support the central pawn chain's integrity, while simultaneously offering escape squares for the king should the d-file become too active. Sacrificing the pawn allows the rook to become incredibly active, aiming to penetrate the weakened queenside and create threats against Black's exposed monarch. Sacrificing the bishop to reclaim the pawn on c6, Black hopes to disrupt White's central pawn structure and gain some dynamic counterplay. But this opens up the d-file for White's rook and could prove to be a very costly decision if White can consolidate their material advantage. A bold recapture, severing Black's central control and establishing a formidable pawn presence deep in their territory, setting the stage for a decisive material imbalance should Black fail to address the immediate threats. Exploiting the open files is paramount now, and bringing the rook to the 7th rank aims to disrupt White's pawn chain and threaten the queen's advanced position, forcing a reaction. Seizing the open file, the rook boldly ventures into the enemy's territory, threatening to dismantle Black's already fractured defenses and prepare for a swift mating attack.